Recently, I called a major Midwestern research university, the biology department of such, to ask about the status of Darwin's theory of evolution. So the professor I spoke with said evolution is a biological fact. So I said, but it's a theory, isn't it? And if it's a theory, it must have some kind of a proof for us to accept it. He said essentially that there's no proof except for the fact that biological science would not be unified without this theory. I further asked him about the existence of a spiritual soul. He said the soul does not exist, and he further offered that emotions and feelings are simply caused by chemicals. Well, I reflected a moment and I said, if man's behavior is influenced by chemical processes, how do we justify in administering justice or holding him accountable for his actions? I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. Today we're going to discuss evolution and the Catholic view of evolution with three Roman Catholic priests who say the traditional Latin Mass exclusively and reject the Second Vatican Council and the new religion which it generated. Father William Jenkins is pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church in Parma, Ohio. Father Donald Sanborn is pastor of St. Pius X Church in Warren, Michigan. And Father Clarence Kelly is spiritual director of St. Joseph's Novitiate, a congregation of traditional Catholic nuns. What is the Catholic view of evolution? What do Catholics believe about evolution?
The theory of evolution is something which is properly in the philosophical order. That the Church doesn't have anything directly to say about philosophy except that it condemns errors, and it also will step in if ever philosophy contradicts its teaching. And here the Catholic Church must step in concerning evolution, and has said that if you mean by evolution that the human beings have come purely from animals and that they are therefore essentially animals, that this is contrary to the teaching of the Catholic Church. It is of Catholic faith that man is composed of body and soul, and that his soul is immortal and it is created directly by God.
What arguments would you advance to demonstrate that man in fact has a spiritual soul?
The fact that he acts in a spiritual way. He manifests an intellect, that he knows things, he knows immaterial things, he knows of justice and charity and goodness, and he wills good things, immaterial good things. This is the main preoccupation of his life, are these immaterial good things, happiness, for example. And the fact that we see in him effects of a spiritual soul, we must conclude that in him there is a spiritual soul, and that he's not merely an animal composed only of matter.
Father Kelly?
In other words, you have to have a sufficient cause for a particular effect, so that if man acts in a way that cannot be explained in terms of chemicals, in terms of physics, then you must conclude that there is in him something which has the capacity to produce such things as abstract thought or behavior based upon a desire to do that which is good and that which is right, and the pursuit of the truth. In other words, there has to be a correspondence between the effect and the cause. It's irrational. It's unreasonable. It's a kind of superstition for people to attribute the rational actions of men to chemicals and to biological causes.
One of the principal things that preoccupy modern human beings is social justice and human rights. Both of those things are immaterial. You cannot see them. Yet, if you read the newspapers or watch TV, this is constantly being brought up as the goal of the human race is to establish social justice and human rights. You never hear animals talking about, you don't hear your cat or your dog talking about social justice or human rights. what you said too, how can we bring people to justice? How, for example, can we bring Noriega to justice if he is simply a heap of chemicals? And that because, you know, he was moved by his chemicals to sell drugs, or moved by his chemicals to do this or that crime. I mean, the judge should just say, well, you know, your chemicals are different from mine. I mean, it's absurd. This is like a crazy idea.
Not only that, as Father Sanborn and Father Kelly say, that man is moved by spiritual ideals. That's true. But we see that he's moved by these spiritual ideals even in spite of what they mean to him physically. A person will undertake great labors and undergo terrible deprivations and sufferings for the sake of some spiritual value that he has. And one may say, well, look at the mother sow protecting her child. That's instinct. The mother sow doesn't make any decisions there, but a man has a decision to make. Like Thomas More, St. Thomas More in the Tower, he had a very definite decision to make. And he chose what was right. He chose his conscience. It's interesting to note that all of those who follow the evolutionary level, plane of things, or the evolutionary thought, always come down to denying the existence of the immortal soul in man, and say that there are no spiritual values, ultimately. Karl Marx said that man was really the creation of the world in which he lived. All of his decisions were motivated by economic considerations, all of them. In other words, man's God is his stomach. That's what makes him what he is. That he doesn't have an immortal soul. Of course, Marxism was based absolutely on the Darwinian theory of evolution, as Marx himself said.
My question is this: we've discussed the soul a little bit. What arguments would you advance against Darwin's theory of evolution, that, you know, everything evolved from this primordial matter?
First of all, the principle that it's based on, and that is something comes from nothing. That you get something from nothing. You get something better from something worse. That is against common sense. Economy doesn't work that way. We don't get money from nothing. We get money from doing work. Gold doesn't just come to us in bags in the front porch. There is a principle of causality, that an effect comes from a cause. And his whole system is based on a greater perfection of beings, of animals, etc., a growing perfection from nothing, essentially, from very imperfect animals, amoebas and what, you know, very low forms of life. That in itself is absurd.
You see, Darwin was a very bad philosopher, and the principles that Father Sanborn is talking about are philosophical principles. But Darwin was also a lousy scientist. In fact, he was not even a scientist. He had no credentials as a scientist, and therefore he had to have someone else sort of stand as the front man for him. But from a strictly scientific point of view, Darwin was just wrong. The information that he based his conclusions on is scientifically wrong. For example, according to Darwin's idea, what you have is this. You have a situation in which, if you look at the fossil record, you are supposed to find gradual, small changes over enormous spans of time. That is what Darwin bases his position on. But you can ask any scientist today who is not being deliberately dishonest, because the honest ones are beginning to admit it. You can ask any scientist today, and he will tell you that the geological record, the record of fossils, does not show that. What the record actually shows is it shows stability. It does not show gradual change producing another species of animal. It shows the exact opposite. It shows stasis, or stability. It shows the prolongation of a particular species. And then what they might find is they might find another completely different species. So the scientific data contradicts one of the fundamental principles upon which Darwinism is based. It's bad science.
Well, Jenkins, you once mentioned that the eye, the existence of the eye, was a very serious stumbling block to evolutionary thought.
Precisely because of what Father Kelly just mentioned. An organ is of no purpose whatsoever until it functions. The eye is of no purpose whatsoever unless it sees. The Darwinian theory of evolution had it that there were millions or billions of small changes over a period of millions and millions of years that ended up with a seeing eye. Darwin said that the progress toward the fruition of that process, a seeing eye, took place because every single step of the way gave an organism an advantage over all of the other organisms. And that's why it survived and they died out. So that eventually, through this long process, you wound up with an eye that sees. But it's ridiculous to say that the changes along that road gave the organism any advantage until the eye was actually complete and saw. Another argument against abortion is that it doesn't wash in the experience.
Evolution.
Sorry. Well, it doesn't wash with the experience of breeders. It doesn't wash with the experience of breeders going back to Luther Burbank, who tried to distort species of plants. And he found that there was a law of reversion to the average, that he could produce a plum as big as the thumbnail. He could produce a plum as much as 6 inches long. But if he kept it up, they would always revert back to the average plum. They would never evolve into another species. And this is with man doing his very best to make them do so.
Well, that is another flaw in Darwin's position. You see, what Darwin did was he observed dog breeders, and he noticed the tremendous success that breeders could have over a period of, say, 20 years. And he said, well, if these breeders could produce such extraordinary changes in 20 years, you can imagine what nature could do in 100 million years. But what Darwin failed to inform the people about is that dog breeders can only bring a species to a certain point. And then one of two things happens. Either it reverts back to the original, or it becomes sterile. In other words, there is a border beyond which they cannot go. And Darwin extrapolated. He took this success the dog breeders had and put it forward as if it could be applied to the change of species when scientifically it can't.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the consequences for Catholics and general consequences and implications of evolutionary thought? Father Jenkins.
Well, I just made a mistake. I talked about abortion all of a sudden. There's a reason for that. Because evolution and abortion kind of go together. Abortion is the logical conclusion of evolutionary thinking. If, we're all products of an evolutionary process which is gradually perfecting the human species in some mindless way, then obviously it's a good idea to start cleaning out the species, just like you'd go in and maybe weed the garden patch, And that's what they do by abortion. They're talking about eugenics and going in and putting to death all the babies who are conceived who eventually develop defects. And also the whole idea of what makes a human being with evolution. According to the evolutionary thinking, a human being is not something that is born, it's something that is made. You eventually become a human being by living your life, having your experiences, putting together your interpersonal relationships, and eventually you're accepted by the human community as a member. This is existentialist thinking, which is nothing but an offshoot of the evolutionary idea of what is human. And so if what is conceived in the womb is not yet human, because it hasn't yet used its will, and doesn't have any social intercommunication yet, then there's no reason on earth why you couldn't go in and just butcher it, which is exactly what they're doing today. You know, the Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2 were signed in 1933 and 1973. And some of the leading names on the Humanist Manifesto 2 were Larry Later and Henry Morgentaler. Later was the one who was the leading man in the push for abortion rights in this country. And Morgentaler is the leading man in Canada for the liberalization of abortion laws in Canada. Humanist Manifesto brings them together. That manifesto called for abortion rights for everybody. At the same time, it was stressing the dignity of the individual. There's a contradiction.
I'd like to remind you, you're watching What Catholics Believe. I'm your host, Julius Smetona. Recently to the connection between evolution and Karl Marx. Could you go into that a little more deeply?
Marx said that he based his dialectical process of history on the teaching of Darwinian evolution. He said that Darwinian evolution, with its theory of survival of the fittest, was, and natural selection, by the way, was the basis in natural science for his doctrine on class struggle and the progress of history by conflict. Marx's whole idea of human life as a commodity of the state is based upon Darwin's theory of evolution, dictating what man really is, and especially what he's not. Thomas Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, because Darwin was neither a scientist nor a polemicist. Thomas Huxley says that Darwin's greatest contribution was to show that God was unnecessary. That is his greatest evolution, according to one of his greatest proponents. That's not much of an achievement.
It's also true that Karl Marx was a student of Hegel. And Hegel was the German philosopher who organized the philosophical theory of evolution, that he said that there was a world spirit that was in constant evolution, constant change. And Marx was a student of Hegel. He had these ideas, and he saw communism as an expression of this social and economic change, this upheaval. They all knew each other. They were all in the same boat together, so to speak. It is just one big group of rotten people who have destroyed the world that we live in.
And I think that what Father Jenkins said and Father Sanborn said hits upon the core of the issue, which is this: why would so many intelligent scientists adhere to this notion with such a dogmatic
tenacity?
Yes. What is there about this? Why don't they stand back and publicly acknowledge that there is a lot of scientific evidence which contradicts these assumptions that they have made? Why don't they do that?
There was an article in the New York Times recently that said that scientists, after having done a study of the DNA of human beings and of gorillas and chimpanzees, concluded that there was not even a remote relationship between gorillas, chimpanzees, and human beings. Mm-hmm. What else? What are we waiting for? Are they on their knees saying "mea culpa, mea culpa"? We've made a mistake. We have to expunge from the textbooks in schools evolution. We've thought that gorillas were part of our ancestors. No, evolution goes on, and as a matter of fact, if you try to teach that God created something, that is considered to be absolutely ridiculous, and it's banned from our schools, even legally, to say that God created something.
I think there are two explanations for Father Kelly's question here. I think one reason why these scientists hold so tenaciously to this religious dogma of theirs, of evolution, is because that's where the money is. That's where the notoriety is. Somebody who does contradict it now, or dares to question it, as Father Sanborn says, is considered an absolute loon and a buffoon. There's no money in that. You can't get research grants and all the rest for that. But I think the other reason is because, rather than scientists, these men have a program for social engineering that they're trying to further. They're trying really to recreate the world. They wish evolution were true, because they have their own program. They want to create a world without God, without souls. They want to somehow create the world that George Harrison sings about, that his guru taught him to dream of.
Evolution is the replacement for God the Creator. and it frees the human race from having to believe what God says and do what he says. And that's an extremely convenient doctrine, and they will insist upon it until they're blue in the face, no matter how much evidence there is against it. Just recently, a few days ago, I read in the New York Times that the satellite that is going through space gathering information about the beginning of the universe is finding that there was no Big Bang, no disorderly explosion, but rather a very orderly creation. This is what it said in the New York Times, which of course is infallible, as everybody knows. And then, yet at the same time, I read in the New York Times a few years ago that it is the common belief of scientists that the dinosaurs turned into birds. I couldn't believe it when I was reading it. I said, oh, this can't be true, that a Tyrannosaurus Rex turns into a sparrow. And we're supposed to believe this. Or a Brontosaurus turns into a robin. I mean, we complain about the Greeks, about their mythology. I mean, the modern world believes things that are really crazy, really stupid and laughable.
And I think it's time to be honest. It's time to be honest with the people, to say that evolution is a religion. It is the religion of the secular humanists. It is their God. It is their doctrine. It is their moral standard. It has no basis whatsoever in philosophy, in reason, and it really has no basis in science. The fundamental law of biology is the law of biogenesis, which says like things produce like things. And yet evolution is based upon the notion that unlike things are produced by other species. So I think it's time to be honest. I think they should simply come out and say that our religion is the religion of evolution, and we are going to use every means we can, even the force of the government itself, to impose our religion on everybody else.
Evolution really is a religion, right? As Father Sanborn said, it's much more ridiculous than anything the ancient Greeks dreamed up.
Talk about superstition.
That's a superstition. You know, we have children who sit around the television set and watch cartoons, and what makes the cartoons so funny is they see animals talking to each other and carrying out human activities. This is really funny. It's ridiculous. It's really hysterical. But if a scientist gets up and starts talking about this kind of thing, about a Tyrannosaurus Rex being transformed into a bird over a period of time, and you know, there's a book written not too long ago called Dinosaur Heresies by a rather prominent paleontologist and archaeologist. He's been on paleontological digs and found amazing things. He closed that book by saying the next time we see the birds fly over, we should sort of nudge each other and say, oh, there go the dinosaurs migrating. It really is, it is ridiculous, and it's about time somebody said so.
You know, we're running out of time, and one question I'd like to ask you is the following. And often in reading Lives of the Saints or some other literature, I see it referred to that the birth of Christ, it took 4,000 years after the fall of man. What are we to believe about that date, and what are we to believe about the fall of man? Did it take place in that day? I mean, was it actual period of 4,000 years?
Well, you have to, the creation of man to the fall of man is, those are two different things. But the creation of man traditionally, according to the fathers and the saints of the church, was 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. Now, the church, with St. Augustine, says that it is permitted to believe that the days of creation were 7 long periods of time. The church does not object to that, but it is true that there is absolutely no evidence of any human being existing before 4,000 years ago. And you do find evidence of a very sudden existence of man, so it confirms that.
I'm sorry we're out of time. Thank you for a fascinating half hour.